The return of shadows. The Sicilian air was different now, heavy, charged with something unseen. The vault beneath Palermo was gone, buried beneath rubble and flame. But Francesco Mori knew better than believe the past could be so easily destroyed. The vow had been erased from history, yet its echoes still remained, rippling through the underworld in whispers too quiet to name, but too dangerous to ignore. For a time, he and Isabella Moreau had tried to return to something resembling a normal life. They had left Sicily, retreating to the quiet edges of Europe, where their names meant nothing and their pasts were merely shadows. But history does not let go so easily, and neither do those who believe it still belongs to them. It began with a presence, unseen at first, but always there, a figure too familiar to be a coincidence, a shadow lingering a second too long at the edge of their vision. Mori had sensed it before Isabella had, but when she did, she had only met his gaze with quiet certainty. They were being watched. Then came the letter. No address, no sender, sealed with a sigil neither of them recognized. The parchment was old, the ink pressed deep into its fibers, as if the words themselves were meant to carry weight beyond the paper they were written on. The fire did not cleanse. The order still stands. Mori had read the words twice, his jaw tightening. He had known, of course. Destroying the vault had not been the end. There had been others, men who had spent their lives in pursuit of its secrets, who had sworn to guard its knowledge. The order was not just a name lost to time. It had always existed in the spaces between power and silence. Now it had returned. The first strike. It happened that night. A quiet evening on the outskirts of Lyon, where they had chosen a temporary refuge. The apartment was sparse, a rented space meant to be nothing more than a place to wait, to breathe. But breath had never been a luxury Mori allowed himself for long. The first sign was the flicker of motion outside the window, too precise, too deliberate. Then the attack came. The glass shattered inward with a force that sent shards spinning through the air. The figures that moved through the darkness were professionals. Silent, swift, their weapons aimed not to kill but to capture. Mori met them with equal precision, his body moving before his mind had finished calculating the angles. A strike to the ribs of the first man, a pivot to disarm the second. The fight was not a brawl, but a careful dismantling of their offense, one measured movement at a time. Isabella had not hesitated. She had spent months preparing for the moment when history would come for them again. She moved with calculated grace, using the chaos to slip past the attackers, her hands already reaching for what she needed, a weapon, an escape route, anything that would keep them ahead of the hunt. They did not stay to finish the fight. There was no victory to be won here, only survival. They vanished into the night, leaving behind the wreckage of what had been meant to be a warning. But warnings were for men who could be frightened. Mori was not one of them. A clue from the ashes. By morning, they had disappeared from Lyon, their presence erased as if they had never been there. But they did not leave empty-handed. One of the attackers had carried something. A fragment of parchment, torn at the edges, its ink faded but still legible. It bore a name, Florence, and beneath it, in the same ancient script as the letter that found them before, a message that made Isabella's breath catch. What was burned was not forgotten. The archive remains. The vault had been destroyed, but something had survived, and the order was waiting for them. Fragments of Truth. The train to Florence moved through the French countryside, like a ghost slipping between worlds. Francesco Mori sat near the window, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape, though his mind was elsewhere, turning over the events of the past 48 hours with the precision of a man dissecting a crime scene. The attack in Lyon had not been a random act of vengeance. It had been a test. Whoever had sent those men had not come to kill, but to see if he and Isabella were still the same people who had burned the vault to the ground. The answer had been clear. They were. Isabella sat across from him, her attention divided between the worn parchment in her hands and the silent calculations unfolding in her mind. The fragment they had taken from their attackers was old, its ink bleeding into the fibers of the page like veins. But even in its damaged state, it carried a message, a reference to an archive, a place that should not exist. The ashes of the past. The archive had been mentioned only once before, in the vault beneath Palermo, just before the walls had collapsed around them. Isabella had dismissed it then, believing the records of the Order had been lost in the flames. But now, with the Order rising again, the name had resurfaced. It was said that before the vow had ever been written, before the vault had been built, the true knowledge of the Order had been kept elsewhere, hidden within the heart of Florence, buried beneath layers of history and deception. The parchment bore a single marking, Basilica di San Lorenzo, one of Florence's oldest churches, a monument to the Medici's reign. Its foundations resting atop crypts that had held the dead for centuries. But if the rumors were true, it also held something else. A secret that had outlived kings, a dangerous offer. As the train neared the Italian border, Mori knew they would not get far without reinforcements. Florence was not Palermo. The Order's influence here ran deeper, woven into the city's academic circles, its aristocracy, its history. They needed a foothold before they were swallowed whole, which meant they needed help. And the only man who could provide it was someone Mori had once sworn to never trust again. Vittorio Leone. The name had haunted Mori ever since they had parted ways beneath the ruins of Palermo. Vittorio had lost everything that day. His ambition had been buried beneath fire and rubble, his claim to the vault's secrets reduced to ash. Mori had expected retribution. Instead, there had been silence. But men like Vittorio did not disappear. They waited, and now, if the Order had resurfaced, then it was certain Vittorio had already positioned himself to either profit from it or to destroy it. The risk of reaching out to him was undeniable. Vittorio did not offer favors without exacting a price. But the Order had nearly taken them once, and Florence would be far less forgiving than Lion. As the train slowed, Mori met Isabella's gaze, reading the hesitation in her expression. He did not need to ask. He already knew her thoughts. There was no other way. If they wanted to survive Florence, they needed a devil in their corner, and Vittorio Leone had always been the devil they knew. Florence Undercover. The city of Florence unfolded before them like a tapestry of history and deception. Under the golden glow of the evening sun, its domes and spires stood timeless, unchanged by the centuries of intrigue that had pulsed beneath its streets. Tourists roamed the piazzas, unaware that the very ground they walked on had once been the playing field of hidden wars. Battles fought not with swords, but with secrets. Francesco Mori and Isabella Moreau moved through the crowd unnoticed, their presence blending into the hum of the city. Yet beneath the surface, they were hunted. The Order had drawn them here for a reason, and Florence was no refuge. It was a battlefield waiting to be set ablaze. A meeting with the devil. The rendezvous had been arranged with precision. No name spoken. No trace left behind. Mori found Vittorio Leone in the back room of a private club near the Ponte Vecchio, a place where old money whispered over glasses of Amaro, where power changed hands beneath the pretense of civility. Vittorio had not changed, his suit impeccable, his posture as effortless as ever. He greeted Mori with a knowing glance, his smile one of amusement rather than welcome. The terms were simple. Vittorio had information, contacts deep within Florence's academic circles, those who still whisper the lost archive hidden beneath Basilica di San Lorenzo. He had tracked the remnants of the Order long before Mori and Isabella had arrived. Their presence only confirmed what he already suspected. The Order had not died with the vault. It had merely retreated, waiting for the right moment to rise again. And now that moment had come. Vittorio offered his help, but his price was steep. He did not deal in loyalty, only in leverage. He wanted something in return, though he did not name it yet. That would come later, when Mori had no choice but to accept. For now, he gave them a name: Professor Alessandro Ferrante, a historian, one of the few living scholars who had studied the original Order. If anyone knew where the archive was hidden, it would be him. But there was one problem. Ferrante was untouchable. The infiltration. To reach Ferrante, Mori and Isabella had entered the exclusive world of Florence's elite, an old academic circle where power was masked behind the guise of knowledge. These were not just scholars. They were keepers of influence, men and women whose research dictated more than just history books. And tonight, they gathered at Palazzo Condorini, a private estate where Ferrante would be among them, an invitation-only affair, filled with those who held the keys to Italy's past and its future. There was no easy way in. Forged identities, borrowed elegance, the quiet confidence of those who belonged. Mori and Isabella had played this game before. They entered the palazzo as guests, their disguise as flawless, their intentions masked behind polite smiles and glasses of Chianti. The room was alive with conversation, words exchanged in carefully measured tones. The scent of aged paper mixed with perfume and wine. The scholars spoke in riddles, their discussions weaving between art, politics, and the unspoken rules of power. Isabella moved first, slipping into the quiet periphery of a discussion between Ferrante and his peers. She played her role well, an academic drawn to the forgotten corners of history, an expert with just enough knowledge to hold his interest. Mori watched from a distance, his attention divided between the gathering and the subtle movements at the room's edges. They were not alone. The Order was here, hidden among the guests, watching, waiting, and then the first warning, a note, slipped into Mori's hand as he passed the bar. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. Do not speak to Ferrante. Do not search for the archive. Leave Florence before it's too late. Mori looked up, scanning the room, but whoever had left it was already gone. The message was clear. They were getting too close, and the Order was ready to strike. A hidden enemy. The note burned in Francesco Mori's hand, like an ember from a fire that refused to die. The warning was clear: leave Florence, abandon the search, or face the consequences. But Mori had never been a man to obey threats. If anything, they only told him one thing: they were on the right path. Across the palazzo's candlelit hall, Isabella Moreau remained locked in conversation with Professor Alessandro Ferrante, her expression one of careful intrigue. She was playing her role perfectly, engaging, curious, appearing as nothing more than an academic eager to discuss forgotten histories. But Mori knew better. Every word exchanged was a step closer to the truth, and every step closer meant they were being watched. He scanned the room again, his instinct sharpening. There was someone else here, not just an observer, but a player in the game, someone who had access to Ferrante, someone who had known they would come, a traitor, a name from the past. Vittorio Leone had been right. Florence was no safer than Palermo, and the Order had not spent centuries surviving without embedding itself in the very places where history was controlled. If someone within this academic circle had ties to the Order, it meant that their enemy was not a distant force lurking in the shadows. It was here, among them. Mori moved through the crowd with calculated ease, listening to murmurs of conversation, noting the subtle shifts in posture, the way certain guests seemed too interested in Isabella's exchange with Ferrante. He recognized the way power operated in a room like this, who gravitated toward whom, who lingered just long enough to overhear the wrong thing. Then he saw him, Luca Belandi, The man was a historian, an expert in Renaissance secret societies, and, until now, someone Mori had considered irrelevant. Belandi had been a minor name in Florence's intellectual circles, a man who had written a handful of books on forgotten orders, but had never truly been taken seriously. Yet here he was, his gaze shifting too often toward Ferrante, his posture too controlled. And more importantly, Mori had seen him before. In Lion, Mori's pulse slowed, his mind locking into focus. Belandi had been there, that night when the assassins had come for them. He had been in the same cafe where Mori and Isabella had studied the parchment from the vault's ruins. He had seen them, and now he was here, the assassin's hand. Mori didn't wait for confirmation. He was already moving. As Isabella and Ferrante continued their discussion, Mori cut across the hall, approaching Belandi as if by accident. Their eyes met for only a second before the man turned away, his body tensing. It was enough. Belandi wasn't just a scholar. He was working with the Order. Mori didn't break pace. He followed Belandi through the shifting crowds, reading the signs, a slight increase in speed, the way his shoulders lifted just enough to betray his awareness of being pursued. Belandi was heading toward the rear of the palazzo, where a terrace overlooked the Arno River. The perfect place to disappear. Mori reached him just as he stepped outside. The cool Florence air wrapped around them as Mori closed the distance, his voice low and sharp. Belandi tensed, his hand twitching towards something beneath his jacket. Mori had already seen the movement before he reached for the knife, twisting the man's wrist and slamming him against the stone railing. The blade clattered to the ground. Belandi struggled, his breath uneven. Then, with a smirk that did not match the fear in his eyes, he whispered something Mori had not expected. "You're too late." A sound, a commotion inside. Mori turned, already knowing what he would see. Isabella was gone. The betrayal unfolds. The palazzo had erupted into chaos. Guests murmured in confusion, but Mori didn't care about them. He moved fast, pushing past bodies, searching for any sign of Isabella. Ferrante was still there, pale, shaken. He had not been the target. She had. The realization hit like a blade to the ribs. The Order had anticipated this. They had let Mori believe he was the one uncovering secrets, that he was the one closing in. But the truth was far worse. They had been waiting for him to deliver Isabella right to them. And now they had her. The chase begins. By the time Mori reached the exit, the streets of Florence stretched before him like an unsolved riddle. The city was vast, its alleyways winding, its secrets endless. But he knew one thing for certain. Isabella was out there, and he would tear Florence apart to get her back. The Silent Cathedral. The streets of Florence blurred as Francesco Mori moved through them, his pulse steady but his mind calculating at an unrelenting speed. Isabella Moreau had been taken. The Order had anticipated their every move, letting them believe they were the ones closing in, when in reality, the trap had been set for them all along. Now, the only question that mattered was, where had they taken her? The Trail of Shadows. The palazzo had become a place of hushed whispers and feigned ignorance, its guests pretending not to have seen what had unfolded in their midst. Mori ignored them. He needed information, and he needed it now. Belandi had been subdued, his smirk fading as he realized just how far Mori was willing to go for answers. The knife wound on his arm was shallow, but the fear in his eyes was real. Mori didn't waste time with pleasantries. Where was Isabella? At first, Belandi had tried to resist, his loyalty to the Order evident in his silence. But Mori knew men like him, intellectuals who believed they held power simply because they possessed knowledge. And knowledge, when used correctly, could be a weapon sharper than any blade. Mori didn't threaten him. He simply told him the truth. The Order had already betrayed him. They had used him as a pawn to lure Mori into Florence, and now that his role had been played, they would discard him just as they had so many others before him. The only thing that could save him now was giving Mori what he needed. It took less than a minute. Belandi muttered a single phrase, his voice barely above a whisper. San Lorenzo. The secrets beneath the basilica. The Basilica di San Lorenzo had stood for centuries, its grand halls echoing with the footsteps of history. It had been the heart of the Medici's Florence, a place of power disguised as faith. But Mori knew what lay beneath. The crypts, hidden beneath the cathedral, buried beneath layers of stone and deception, was a network of tunnels and chambers that had long been forgotten by the world above. If the Order had taken Isabella, it was because they intended to extract something from her, knowledge, leverage, or perhaps simply vengeance. Either way, he had no time to waste. A descent into darkness. The cathedral was quiet when Mori arrived, its towering columns bathed in dim candlelight. Outside, the streets were alive with the sound of Florence at night. Music, laughter, the hum of a city that did not know war was being waged beneath its feet. Mori moved with purpose, his path taking him through the nave and toward a section that had long been closed to the public. He had studied the history of this place, knew the legends that whispered of hidden passageways, of locked doors that led nowhere or everywhere. He found the entrance beneath a carved altar, a forgotten stairwell leading downward, its steps worn smooth by centuries of use. The scent of damp stone and age-old incense filled the air as he descended, the silence wrapping around him like a second skin. Then he heard it, a voice, low, measured, and then Isabella's. The confrontation. The chamber was illuminated by flickering torches, their flames casting long shadows over the stone walls. Isabella stood in the center, her posture rigid but unbroken. Across from her, a figure watched with unsettling patience. The leader of the Order. Mori had expected an elder, someone burdened by the weight of centuries of secrecy. But the person before him was not an old scholar or a relic of the past. He was young, calculated, a man who had grown up in the world of power and deception, not merely inherited it. And his face was familiar, too familiar. Mori's breath slowed as realization settled over him like ice. The man standing before him, the one who had orchestrated everything, who had led the Order out of the shadows and back into the world. He was a Mori, a distant branch of the family, long thought lost to history. But not lost, not forgotten. And now, the past had returned not as a ghost, but as a reckoning. The leader smiled.
Welcome home, Francesco.
Dangerous liaisons. The words hung in the air like the final note of a requiem. Welcome home, Francesco. Mori did not move. His pulse remained steady, but his mind was already recalculating, reassembling everything he thought he knew. The man standing before him, the leader of the Order, bore his own name like a weapon, like a brand forged in blood and history. A Mori. For years, Francesco had fought to sever himself from the legacy his name carried, from the weight of a past soaked in power and violence. And yet, here it was, staring back at him from the shadows of the Basilica di San Lorenzo. Isabella Moreau stood nearby, her wrists bound, but her gaze steady. She had heard it too. She had spent months untangling the mysteries of the vow, of the Order's origins. And now she understood. This was never just about history. It had always been about blood, the forgotten heir. The man before them exuded control. His presence was not that of an old-world scholar or a forgotten relic of power. He was something else, a man who had built the Order anew, shaping it for a modern world, a world that had nearly erased him. His name was Adriano Mori, a distant relative, lost to time, hidden within the cracks of history. The Mori bloodline had been fractured generations ago, divided between those who had embraced the shadows and those who had sought to escape them. Francesco had grown up in the periphery of that world, never fully part of it, yet never free of it. Adriano, it seemed, had been cast to the depths of it.
You burned the vault.
Adriano said, his voice devoid of anger, but not of meaning.
You thought that would be the end of it.
Mori's jaw tightened. The vault beneath Palermo had been the Order's strongest hold on history, a record of names and betrayals that had dictated Sicily's fate for centuries. He had destroyed it because no one should have held that power. But Adriano had never needed the vault. The Order had survived, hidden in the cracks of Europe's elite, waiting for the moment to rise again, a choice in the shadows. Adriano stepped forward, the torchlight casting long shadows across his face.
You should have let history die,
he said.
But now, you've left me no choice.
Mori knew what was coming before Adriano even finished speaking. The Order had Isabella. They had chosen her as leverage, not as a scholar or a historian, but as something far more valuable, his weakness. Adriano did not need to kill Mori. He only needed him to break.
You know what we are.
Adriano continued, his voice calm.
You spent your life fighting the inevitable. But the Order is not a relic, Francesco. It is the future. And you, whether you accept it or not, are a part of that future.
Mori exhaled slowly. He had been given ultimatums before, had been forced into impossible decisions. But this was different. This was personal. Join the Order. Become what he was meant to be. Or watch Isabella disappear into the abyss, never to be seen again. Adriano's expression remained unreadable. He was not asking Mori to surrender. He was asking him to choose a side. The weight of betrayal. Mori met Isabella's gaze, searching for the answer he already knew. She would not beg for her life. She never had. But he saw something else in her expression. Trust. A silent message, unspoken but clear. He had come for her. Now, he needed to finish what they had started. Mori turned back to Adriano, his posture shifting ever so slightly. A subtle movement, one that could be mistaken for consideration. Adriano smiled. For the briefest moment, he thought he had won. Then Mori moved, not toward him, not toward surrender, but toward Isabella's captor. The strike was swift, precise, a blade sliding between ribs before the man even had a chance to react. The guard staggered, gasping, and in that instant of chaos, Mori reached for Isabella, tearing her free of her bonds. Adriano's expression did not change. He did not lunge forward, did not shout for his men to fire. He only watched, as if this had been a possibility he had expected all along.
Run, then.
Adriano said quietly, as the chamber erupted into violence.
But this is not over.
Into the night. Mori and Isabella did not look back as they disappeared into the labyrinthine tunnels beneath Florence. The sounds of pursuit echoed behind them, but they knew the city better than their hunters. Every alleyway, every forgotten passage carved through centuries of stone. By the time they emerged into the cold night air, the cathedral bells had begun to toll. A warning, a promise. Mori turned to Isabella, his breath steady despite the chase. She was watching him, not with fear, but with understanding. Adriano had let them escape, because this had never been about capturing them. It had been about sending a message. The Order was no longer hiding. It was ready to reclaim its place in the world, and it had already chosen its war. The Order Reborn. Florence had never seemed more alive, yet Mori and Isabella moved through it like ghosts, slipping through ancient alleyways where the past clung to the stones. The city belonged to the Order now, not just in its history, but in its present. Adriano Mori had let them go, not out of mercy, but out of certainty. The Order was no longer lurking in the shadows. It had re-emerged, not as a remnant of forgotten past, but as a force woven into the very fabric of Italy's power structure. And soon the world would know it. A city on the brink, From the safety of their temporary hideout, a small apartment overlooking the Arno, Mori and Isabella watched Florence shift around them. The signs were subtle but undeniable. Certain scholars had disappeared. Influential figures had gone silent. Newspapers carried articles about unexplained financial movements, subtle shifts in government policy, the quiet erasure of names from historical records. The Order was making its move. And Adriano had wasted no time. Within 2 days of their escape, the name Confraternita della Luce had resurfaced. The Brotherhood of Light, a name that had not been spoken in public for centuries. It was the old name of the Order, a title that had once ruled Sicily, Florence, and Rome alike. And now it was returning. But this time it was not whispered in secrecy. It was being announced. Officially, it was nothing more than an elite historical society, a collective of scholars and aristocrats dedicated to preserving Italy's true heritage. A harmless foundation, funded by wealthy patrons, with public forums and exclusive gatherings held in the most prestigious locations. But Mori knew what it really was. A declaration, a way of telling the world that history was not just remembered, it was controlled, a dangerous invitation. The first true blow came not through violence, but through elegance. A formal invitation arrived, delivered in a black envelope, its gold lettering precise, its message clear. The Confraternita della Luce welcomes you to an evening of history, reflection, and rebirth. The location? Palazzo Medici Riccardi, one of Florence's oldest and most prestigious landmarks, a place where men had once ruled empires from behind closed doors. The date? Tomorrow. Mori exhaled, his grip on the invitation tightening. Adriano was not hunting them anymore. He was daring them to come. The weight of blood. Isabella studied the invitation in silence, her fingers tracing the raised crest at the bottom, the same symbol they had seen in the vault beneath Palermo, the same mark that had dictated Sicily's fate for centuries.
"We can't ignore this,"
she murmured, knowing what Mori was thinking. He nodded, his jaw set. They had spent their time running, reacting, chasing after history, while others dictated its course. But this was different. This was Adriano's move. If they didn't act now, the Order would embed itself into the highest circles of power, not as a secret, but as a public force. It was no longer enough to expose them. They had to stop them, preparing for war. Vittorio Leone was waiting when Mori contacted him. His voice, smooth and measured as always, carried no surprise.
"I was wondering when you'd call."
Mori did not waste time with formalities. The Order is making its move. Vittorio chuckled, but there was no humor in it.
"They're making several moves. You burned down a vault, Francesco. You thought that would be the end of it."
Mori clenched his jaw. "I need to know what Adriano is planning." There was a pause. Then Vittorio spoke again, his voice lower, sharper.
"I'll help you, but you already know my price."
Mori closed his eyes briefly. He had always known it would come to this. A debt to Vittorio was a chain, one that would never fully break. But there was no other way. "Fine," Mori said, "but I choose the time and the place." Vittorio's amusement returned.
"Of course you do."
The line went dead. Isabella was watching him, her expression unreadable.
"You trust him?"
"No," Mori said. "But I trust that he wants Adriano gone as much as we do." The calm before the storm. That night, Mori stood on the terrace, staring out at Florence. Tomorrow, they would walk into the lion's den. Adriano had spent years building this moment, shaping the Order into something new, something untouchable. The Confraternita della Luce was no longer a whisper in the dark. It was rising, unstoppable, inevitable, unless they stopped it. Mori exhaled slowly. For the first time in years, he was not just a detective, he was a Mori, and history was waiting for his next move. Bloodlines. Florence lay beneath a bruised sky, the distant hum of the city an undercurrent to the thoughts unraveling in Francesco Mori's mind. The invitation to the Order's gathering at Palazzo Medici Riccardi had been more than a summons. It had been a challenge. The Order was no longer content to operate in secrecy. Now it wished to be seen, to be acknowledged as a force reborn. Mori had spent his life untangling conspiracies, peeling back the layers of power to expose the truth beneath. Yet this was something different. This was personal. The man behind the resurgence of the Order was not just an enemy. He was family. Adriano Mori. The revelation had settled in Mori's mind like a stone dropped into deep water, sending ripples through everything he had believed about his lineage. A distant relative, thought lost of history, now standing at the head of an organization that had shaped Sicily, Florence, and Rome in ways few had ever understood. And now, Adriano had invited him back into the fold. The weight of history pressed against Mori's shoulders. The Order was not just a relic of the past. It was a design, a living entity that had adapted to survive. The vault in Palermo had been only one piece of a much larger puzzle, and by destroying it, he had merely drawn attention to himself, proved himself worthy, in Adriano's eyes, of standing among those who dictated history rather than chasing after its remains. But Mori had no intention of joining. His purpose now was singular, to dismantle the Order before it could cement itself in the world again. The gathering at Palazzo Medici Riccardi. The evening of the Order's gathering arrived with the weight of inevitability. Florence's elite had assembled within the grand halls of the Medici Palace, their presence a testament to the Order's reach. Scholars, aristocrats, financiers, all had come, drawn by the promise of history reshaped in their favor. Mori and Isabella entered unnoticed, their presence concealed behind carefully chosen identities. They moved through the corridors of power, their eyes taking the subtle gestures of those around them, the careful nods, the unspoken agreements, the weight of influence shifting in real time. At the heart of it all stood Adriano. He moved through the room with the ease of a man who knew he had already won. He did not need to demand respect. It was given freely, an acknowledgement of the inevitability of his ascent. The Order was not merely a shadowy brotherhood. It was a structure woven into the foundations of power, resurfacing only when the time was right. And now the time had come. The revelation. It was only after the speeches, after the carefully orchestrated words had been spoken, that Mori found himself face to face with Adriano once more. Adriano spoke of lineage, of duty, of the burden carried by those who bore the name Mori. The past had been written by men like them, and the future, he claimed, should be no different. He did not demand allegiance, he offered it, as though it were a gift rather than a chain. Mori listened, knowing that every word was a thread in a web designed to ensnare him. Then came the truth he had not expected. Adriano had not merely reassembled the Order. He had reshaped it. The old ways had been flawed, bound by secrecy and hesitation. Now, the Order would not simply exist in the shadows. It would rule, and Mori had been given a place within it, whether he wanted it or not. His family's name had never been erased from the records, merely held in waiting. He had spent his life believing he had stepped away from the ghosts of his ancestry, only to find that they had never let him go. The choice that was no choice. The moment hung in the air, stretching between them like the vast halls of the palazzo. Adriano did not need to threaten him. There was no need. The Order had already placed its pieces on the board. The question was whether Mori would play by its rules or attempt to upend them entirely. But Mori had always been a man who chose his own path. The Order had mistaken him for someone who could be controlled by blood, by legacy. But Mori was not his ancestors. He did not believe in history's right to dictate the future. He would not join them, and that meant war. The knowledge settled between them, unspoken yet absolute. Adriano did not react with anger, only with certainty. He had always known Mori's choice. And so, the next move was his. A subtle glance from Adriano, a flicker of motion at the edge of the hall. Mori knew what it meant before the shift even fully registered. The doors of the palazzo were closing. The Order had gathered its allies, and they had no intention of letting him leave. The final gambit. The great doors of Palazzo Medici Riccardi closed with a quiet finality, the heavy iron locks engaging with a sound that seemed almost ceremonial. Around Francesco Mori, the air in the grand hall shifted. Subtle movements, quiet glances exchanged between those who understood that this was no longer a gathering, but a trap. The Order had made its move. He had expected something like this. Adriano Mori had never needed threats or ultimatums. His strength lay in inevitability. Francesco's refusal had not sparked outrage or violence. It had merely confirmed a course of action that had already been set into motion. This was not an attempt to kill him. This was an attempt to convert him by force. The guests who had arrived under the guise of scholars and aristocrats were shifting now, their posture no longer that of mere observers. They were participants, allies of the Order, some with deep roots in Florence's elite, others drawn by the promise of a place in the world Adriano was building. Adriano himself stood at the top of the marble staircase, calm as ever. He did not need to raise his voice to command the room. He simply watched, waiting for Francesco to understand the reality before him. The Order was not offering him a choice anymore. He was either with them, or he would not leave this palace alive. The breaking point. Francesco scanned the room, his mind processing escape routes, threats, and advantages in the span of a single breath. There were too many. Even if he fought his way out, the Order's reach extended beyond these walls. The moment he left Florence, he would be hunted across Europe. But this was not just about him. Isabella Moreau was somewhere within these halls. He had lost sight of her when the gathering had shifted, but he knew she was not gone. The Order had made her part of their plan as well, though whether as bait or leverage remained to be seen. Then, a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision. Vittorio Leone, the Sicilian crime lord, was here, standing among the guests with the same effortless composure he carried everywhere. He had told Mori he would help, but Mori had never trusted his definition of the word. Vittorio played his own games, and his presence here meant one thing. He had known. The betrayal, if it could be called that, was not surprising. Vittorio had always chosen the side that benefited him the most. The real question was whether he had come as an observer or a participant. Then, from somewhere beyond the main hall, a sound, a sharp crack, distant but unmistakable. Gunfire. And just like that, the gathering unraveled. Chaos and smoke. Mori moved before the first screams echoed through Palazzo. He had been waiting for an opportunity. And this was it. Whatever had just happened, whoever had fired that shot, had forced the Order to shift its attention. It was all he needed. He cut through the room like a blade, weaving through the shifting bodies, his movements precise. A man reached for him. Mori disabled him before he could react. Another blocked his path. Mori did not slow as he struck, moving past before the man even hit the ground. The sound of more gunfire erupted from deeper within the palazzo, sending waves of panic through the assembled guests. This was no longer a controlled operation. Something had gone wrong. Then he saw her. Isabella. She was at the far end of the hall, moving against the tide of panicked guests, her face set in determination. She had freed herself. Mori caught her gaze for only a moment before she lifted something in her hand. A small, flickering device. An explosive charge. She had not come here just to escape. She had come to destroy the Order's meeting place. And she was seconds away from doing it. The Order fractures. Adriano had seen it too. He was already moving, his voice cutting through the chaos, issuing orders to his men. But the balance had already shifted. The Order was not prepared for this. They had expected Mori to fight or surrender, but they had not expected him to come with a contingency plan of his own. The charge detonated. It was not meant to bring down the entire palazzo. Isabella had been careful, precise. The explosion was targeted, shattering structural supports, sending pieces of the ceiling crashing down, turning control gathering into an uncontrolled disaster. Panic overtook the Order's guests. Some fled, others hesitated. The illusion of dominance that Adriano had built was fracturing before his eyes. Mori reached Isabella in seconds, covering her as debris rained down. They had seconds, maybe less, before the true weight of the building's collapse set in. Then he felt a presence behind him. Vittorio, the crime lord, had not run. He stood amidst the chaos, watching Mori with the same unreadable expression as always. And then, in that moment of uncertainty, he moved, not toward Mori, but toward Adriano. He was making his choice. The fall of the Order, for now. Vittorio had always been a man who understood timing, and tonight was no different. With the Order weakened, with Mori proving he would not be controlled, Vittorio was choosing opportunity over loyalty. As Mori and Isabella fought their way toward the exit, he caught one last glimpse of Adriano. The leader of the Order stood at the heart of the crumbling palace, his expression not of rage, but of calculation. This was not his end. This was only a setback. Mori knew they had not killed the Order tonight, but they had done something far more dangerous. They had forced it into the open. As they vanished into the streets of Florence, escaping before the authorities arrived, Mori understood the reality of what came next. The war was not over. The Order had been broken, but not destroyed. And soon, Adriano would strike back. Echoes of power. The city of Florence was still standing, but beneath its gilded facades, the balance of power had shifted. The explosion at Palazzo Medici Riccardi had shattered more than stone and marble. It fractured the very foundation of the Order's resurgence. Yet, as Francesco Mori and Isabella Moreau fled through the city's winding alleyways, slipping away before the authorities could contain the chaos, they both knew one undeniable truth. The war was far from over. The aftermath. By dawn, Florence was already reshaping the narrative. The media called it a tragic accident, an unexpected structural failure in the historic palace during a private event. The Confraternita della Luce issued a statement, condemning the destruction, vowing to continue their historical preservation efforts despite the setback. Names were carefully omitted, details blurred just enough to make the truth indistinguishable from the cover story. This was how the powerful operated, not through denial, but through control. Mori watched the reports from the small apartment they had secured in the outskirts of the city. He had expected nothing less. Adriano Mori would not allow the world to see his failure. The Order had been exposed, but it was far from destroyed. Sitting at the table, Isabella Moreau sifted through the remnants of documents she had taken before the explosion. She had always known that history was rewritten by those who survived it, and tonight had proven that survival was not enough. The Order had existed for centuries, woven into the highest circles of power, adapting with each passing era. But now, for the first time, it had been wounded, and wounds left scars. Vittorio's play. It was no surprise when the call came. Vittorio Leone had remained neutral during the collapse of the Palazzo, but Mori had recognized his intentions before they had even left the building. Vittorio had not chosen a side. He had waited to see which side would be left standing. His voice, smooth and unhurried, carried no satisfaction, only calculated amusement. The Order was weakened, he said, but not dead, and that meant a vacuum had formed. Wherever power receded, another force would rise to take its place. And now, Vittorio was in a position to decide what filled that space. Mori had known this moment would come. By fighting the Order, he had done more than disrupt its influence. He had created an opportunity. For men like Vittorio, opportunity was everything. But Mori did not answer immediately. He knew that accepting any alliance came with a price. And yet, walking away meant leaving the battlefield to those who thrived in the shadows. Vittorio did not wait for a response. He simply left him with one final thought. The Order had survived for centuries, And Adriano Mori was still alive. This was not the end. It was only the beginning of something much larger. The decision. As Mori set the phone down, Isabella studied him from across the room. She had watched him battle his past, seen him wrestle with the weight of his name. But she had also seen him make choices, not out of obligation, but out of something deeper. She knew the question before he even spoke it aloud. Did they walk away, or did they step back into fire? Mori exhaled slowly, looking out over the rooftops of Florence. The Order would never stop. Adriano would never stop. And neither could they. The vow had been buried once before, but history had a way of resurfacing. If they wanted to end this, they had to go deeper than before. Find the Order's true heart, the one thing even Adriano couldn't afford to lose. Only then would the echoes of the past finally fade into silence. Mori turned to Isabella. There was no hesitation in his voice. They were going to Rome, and this time they were going to finish it.